Sometimes the past catches up with us when we least expect it. For Samuel Clayton, that moment came on a quiet Tuesday morning when everything he thought he knew about himself was about to change forever. Samuel was a wealthy cattle baron who owned the biggest ranch in Wyoming Territory. For 25 years, he'd been the most powerful man for miles around. But when a wild-looking mountain woman knocked on his door that morning, everything changed. She was rough and weathered, with tangled hair and worn buckskin clothes. Her fierce blue eyes held a secret that could destroy everything Samuel had built. What truth from his buried past has finally caught up with the untouchable cattle king? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Clayton ranch as Samuel stood on his wraparound porch, surveying the vast expanse of his domain. Rolling hills stretched beyond the horizon, dotted with thousands of cattle bearing his brand. The sight still filled him with pride after all these years. "Mr. Clayton, your coffee, sir," said Thomas, his aging butler, appearing with a silver tray. The man had served him faithfully for 15 years, ever since Samuel had become prosperous enough to afford such luxuries. "Thank you, Thomas." Samuel accepted the fine china cup, inhaling the rich aroma. Everything about his life spoke of success and refinement, a far cry from the desperate man who had arrived in Wyoming Territory with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of grief. The main house was a testament to his achievements. 2 stories of imported timber and stone, with glass windows that caught the morning light like jewels. Inside, Margaret would be directing the household staff, her gentle voice organizing their comfortable world with practiced efficiency. Margaret Clayton was everything a man of his standing deserved: beautiful, educated, and born into proper society back in Boston. She had brought grace and respectability to his rough frontier success when they married 12 years ago. At 42, she remained elegant, with graying auburn hair always perfectly arranged, and a wardrobe that rivaled anything found in the finest eastern cities. "Will Mrs. Clayton be joining you for breakfast?" Thomas inquired, adjusting his crisp uniform. "She's visiting the Pemberton ladies this morning," Samuel replied, watching his foreman Miguel directing the ranch hands toward the eastern pastures. The Mexican had been with him for 8 years, a reliable man who understood cattle and respected hard work. "Have Miguel checked the fence lines by Miller's Creek? The winter storms may have damaged them." Thomas nodded and retreated into the house, his footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors. Samuel appreciated the quiet efficiency of his staff. Besides Thomas and Miguel, there was Elena, the cook whose enchiladas could make a grown man weep with joy, and young Billy, the stable boy who had an almost mystical way with horses. The ranch employed another dozen hands, mostly good men who respected Samuel's fairness and the wages he paid. Unlike many cattle barons who ruled through fear and cheapness, Samuel had learned that loyalty bought with respect lasted longer than obedience bought with intimidation. As he sipped his coffee, Samuel's eyes wandered to the family cemetery on the hill behind the house. Margaret's parents rested there, having passed during a harsh winter 3 years prior. They had accepted him despite his mysterious past, trusting their daughter's judgment and his obvious devotion to her. The sound of approaching horses drew his attention to the main road. A supply wagon from town wound its way up the long drive, kicking up dust in the dry morning air. Samuel recognized the driver as Old Pete, who made weekly deliveries of goods from the general store. "Morning, Mr. Clayton," Pete called out, tipping his weather-beaten hat. "Got your supplies and some mail from back east." Samuel descended the porch steps, his boots clicking against the stone pathway Margaret had insisted upon. She claimed it gave the entrance a civilized appearance, and he supposed she was right. Details like that mattered when you were building a reputation. "Anything urgent, Pete?" Samuel asked, sorting through the letters. Bills from suppliers, correspondence from other ranchers, and a thick envelope bearing the seal of his Boston lawyer. "That one, there came special delivery," Pete said, pointing to an official-looking envelope. "Clerk at the post office said it was mighty important." Samuel nodded, tucking the mail into his vest pocket. "Elena's got fresh biscuits if you're hungry." "Much obliged, but I've got 3 more stops before noon." Pete gathered his reins. "You take care now, Mr. Clayton." As the wagon rumbled away, Samuel found himself studying the distant mountains that formed the northern boundary of his property. Somewhere up there, hidden among the peaks and valleys, lived the mountain folk-hardy people who scratched out an existence in the unforgiving wilderness. He rarely gave them much thought, focused as he was on his cattle and the business of being prosperous. Walking back toward the house, Samuel paused at Margaret's flower garden. She had coaxed roses and lavender to bloom in this harsh climate, creating a small oasis of eastern elegance in the rugged frontier. The sight always reminded him of her gentle persistence, the way she had gradually softened the rough edges of his character without trying to change who he was fundamentally. Inside the house, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times. The sound echoed off the mahogany paneling and oil paintings Margaret had selected to give their home a sense of history and culture. Sometimes Samuel felt like an actor playing a role in this refined setting, though the feeling had diminished over the years. His study beckoned from across the foyer, its leather-bound books and heavy desk representing the educated gentleman he had become. Maps of his property covered one wall, marking every creek, pasture, and boundary line. Another wall displayed photographs of prize bulls and certificates from cattle shows where his livestock had won ribbons. But it was the locked drawer in his desk that held his deepest secrets. Inside lay a worn leather journal, its pages filled with memories he had tried desperately to forget. 25 years of building a new life, yet those faded entries still had the power to bring him to his knees. The journal contained the truth about Samuel Clayton, that he had not always been a cattle baron, had not always lived in Wyoming, and had not always been alone in the world. Before Margaret, before the ranch, before his carefully constructed identity, there had been another life entirely. Samuel shook his head, dismissing the melancholy thoughts that sometimes crept in during quiet moments. He had worked too hard and come too far to dwell on what could not be changed. The past was buried, and he intended to keep it that way. Through the study window, he could see Miguel training a new horse in the corral. The man's patience with difficult animals was legendary among the ranch hands. Samuel often thought there was a lesson in that patientsome creatures just needed time and understanding to become their best selves. The front door's brass knocker suddenly echoed through the house with 3 sharp raps. Samuel frowned, checking his pocket watch. Visitors were rare at this hour, and Margaret was not expected back until afternoon. Perhaps Pete had forgotten something, or Miguel needed to discuss an urgent matter about the herd. Thomas appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a pristine towel. "Shall I answer it, sir?" "No, I'll get it," Samuel said, already moving toward the foyer. Something about those knocks felt different, urgent, yet controlled, as if the person outside understood the gravity of whatever had brought them to his door. As Samuel's hand closed around the ornate door handle, he had no way of knowing that his carefully ordered world was about to shatter. The leather journal in his locked desk drawer seemed to pulse with dormant energy, as if the secrets it contained were finally ready to emerge into the light. Behind the heavy oak door waited a truth he had spent 25 years trying to escape. Samuel opened the door and felt his heart stop. The woman standing on his porch was like something carved from the mountains themselves, wild, weathered, and utterly out of place against the refined backdrop of his home. Her dark hair hung in tangled braids adorned with small bones and feathers. Buckskin clothing, softened by years of wear, spoke of a life lived far from civilization. But it was her eyes that struck him, most pale blue, fierce, and somehow familiar. "Samuel Clayton," she said, her voice carrying the roughness of wind through canyon walls. "Or should I call you Papa?" The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the stone pathway. Those eyes knew those eyes. They belonged to another face, a smaller face, framed by golden curls instead of dark braids. "Who are you?" he whispered, though his heart already knew the impossible answer. "My name is Sarah Clayton," She stepped closer, and he could see the calluses on her hands, the small scars that marked a life of survival. Though the mountain folk who raised me called me Little Sparrow. Samuel gripped the doorframe to steady himself. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, threatening to spill him into an abyss of memory and regret. That's not possible. You died in the fire. Both of you died. Sarah's expression softened with something that might have been pity. Mama died that night, but I didn't. She reached into a leather pouch at her waist and withdrew something small and wooden. You made this for me when I was 5, remember? In her palm sat a tiny wooden doll, carved with loving detail. Samuel's own hands had shaped every curve, painted the small blue dress, added strands of yellow yarn for hair. He had given it to his daughter on her 6th birthday, just 3 months before the fire that destroyed everything. Anna, he breathed, using the name he had not spoken in 25 years. The mountain people called me Sarah after they found me, she continued. I was half dead from smoke and burns, wandering in the woods 3 miles from our cabin. Old Marie and her husband Joseph took me in, nursed me back to health. By the time I could speak clearly again, months had passed. They tried to find you, but folks in town said you'd gone mad with grief and disappeared. Samuel's legs threatened to give way. He remembered those awful weeks after the fire, the desperate search through the ashes, the growing certainty that his wife Catherine and little Anna were gone forever. The guilt had nearly destroyed him, guilt that he had been away on business when the fire started, guilt that he had failed to protect them, guilt that he had eventually stopped looking and fled west to escape the pain. I looked for you, he said, his voice breaking. I searched for months. There was nothing left of the cabin, no trace. The wind carried me far from the cabin that night, Sarah said gently. Mama threw me out the window when the flames got too high. I ran blindly through the smoke and collapsed by Miller's Creek. If Joseph hadn't been checking his traps the next morning, I would have died there. The name Miller's Creek hit Samuel like a physical blow. There was a Miller's Creek on his current property, and he had named it after the one back home without really thinking about why. Even in building his new life, he had unconsciously carried pieces of the old one with him. Why now? Samuel asked, his voice barely audible. Why come to me now after all these years? Sarah's face hardened, the momentary softness replaced by the steely determination of someone who had survived against impossible odds. Because the mountain folk who saved my life are in trouble, and you're the only one with enough power and money to help them. She reached into her pouch again and pulled out a folded paper, official-looking and bearing several stamps. Developers want our land. They're saying we don't have legal claim to territory my family has lived on for 30 years. They're coming with the law, and if we don't leave, they'll make us leave. Samuel took the paper with trembling fingers. It was a legal notice demanding evacuation within 30 days, signed by territorial officials he recognized. The land in question was described in terms that placed it in the high country north of his ranch, in areas he had always assumed were uninhabitable. There are 43 people in our community, Sarah continued. Children, elders, families who know no other life. They saved me when I had nothing, raised me as their own daughter. I won't let them be driven away like animals. But why me? Why not the territorial government or... Because you have influence, they don't. Because you're wealthy enough that men listen when you speak. Because you're my father, and this is the only thing I'll ever ask of you. The weight of her words settled over Samuel like a heavy blanket. Here was his daughter alive, grown, transformed into something he never could have imagined. The little girl who had loved pretty dresses and tea parties had become a mountain woman, fierce and self-reliant. The fire had taken away his sweet Anna and given the world Sarah, a daughter forged by hardship into something altogether different. I need to think, he said finally. It's a lot to process. Sarah nodded, understanding flickering in those familiar blue eyes. I know. I've had 25 years to think about this moment. You've had about 5 minutes. She turned to go, then paused. I'm camped by the old oak tree near your south pasture. I'll wait 3 days for your answer. After that, I'll find another way to help my people. Sarah! he called after her, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "Where did you learn my real name? How did you know to find me here?" She looked back over her shoulder, and for a moment he saw a ghost of the little girl she had been. "I never forgot you, Papa, and when you're living in the mountains, you hear things. Stories travel strange paths up there. It took me 5 years to piece together what happened to Samuel Clayton after he disappeared from Missouri." Then she was walking away, her stride confident and purposeful, leaving Samuel standing in his doorway with the shattered remains of his coffee cup at his feet and the impossible truth of her existence burning in his chest. Samuel sat alone in his study for the rest of the morning, staring at the wooden doll Sarah had shown him. He had retrieved it from where she left it on the porch, his hands shaking as he picked up the tiny figure. Every detail was exactly as he remembered: the blue dress, the yellow yarn hair, even the small chip in the wood where Anna had dropped it once. The locked drawer in his desk seemed to call to him. Inside lay not just his leather journal, but other remnants of his former life. With trembling fingers, he unlocked it and withdrew a folded paper he had not looked at in years. The marriage certificate was yellowed with age, its formal script declaring the union between Samuel Clayton and Catherine Marie Hoffman on June 15th, 1849. Her maiden name, written in careful copperplate, brought back memories of her laughter, her gentle hands, her way of humming while she cooked. Catherine had been everything good in his world, and their daughter Anna had been the light that made everything else meaningful. Samuel traced the signatures with his finger. His own handwriting looked young and hopeful, full of confidence about the future they would build together. Catherine's signature was smaller, more delicate, with little flourishes that spoke of her artistic nature. She had painted watercolors of wildflowers and taught Anna to see beauty in simple things. The door to his study opened softly, and Margaret appeared with a concerned expression. "Samuel, Thomas said you seemed upset this morning, and there's broken china on the front porch." He quickly slipped the marriage certificate back into the drawer, but not before Margaret caught a glimpse of it, her green eyes sharpened with curiosity and something that might have been worry. "It's nothing, dear," Samuel said, forcing a smile. "Just some business correspondence that caught me off guard." Margaret moved closer, her silk dress rustling softly. She had always been perceptive, able to read his moods with uncanny accuracy. It was one of the things that made their marriage work so well, her intuitive understanding of when to press and when to give him space. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said gently, settling into the chair across from his desk. "What's troubling you?" Samuel studied his wife's face, noting the genuine concern there. How could he explain that his past had literally walked up to their front door? How could he tell her about the daughter he had never mentioned, the first wife whose memory he had buried so deep that even Margaret's love could not reach it? "There was a visitor this morning," he said carefully. "Someone from before I came to Wyoming." Margaret's expression grew more serious. In 12 years of marriage, Samuel had shared very little about his life before arriving in the territory. She knew he had come from Missouri, that he had lost everything in some kind of tragedy, but he had always claimed the details were too painful to discuss. She had respected his privacy, understanding that some wounds needed time to heal. "Someone you knew well?" she asked. "Very well." Samuel stood and walked to the window, needing distance from Margaret's penetrating gaze. "Someone I thought was dead." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and careful calculations. Margaret was not a woman to pry unnecessarily, but she was also not foolish enough to ignore signs of serious trouble. "Samuel," she said finally, "whatever this is about, we can face it together. We've built a good life here, a strong partnership. Nothing from the past can change that unless you let it." Her words were meant to comfort, but they only made Samuel's guilt heavier. Margaret deserved honesty, but the truth felt too enormous to speak aloud. How could he explain that he had been a husband and father before, that he had loved completely and lost everything? How could he admit that part of him had died in that fire, and that the man she married was only a shadow of who he had once been? Through the window, he could see the oak tree where Sarah had said she would be waiting. Even from this distance, he could make out smoke from a small fire, evidence of her presence. She was real, not some fever dream brought on by too much whiskey and not enough sleep. His daughter transformed, hardened, but undeniably alive. "I may need to travel for a few days," he said without turning around. "Handle some old business that's come up unexpectedly." "Of course," Margaret replied, though he could hear the questions in her voice. "Shall I have Elena prepare supplies for the trip?" "Not yet. I'm still deciding what needs to be done." Margaret rose from her chair, the sound of her footsteps crossing the room to where he stood. Her hand touched his shoulder, warm and reassuring through his shirt. "Whatever burden you're carrying," she said softly, "you don't have to carry it alone. I chose to marry you knowing you had suffered losses. I didn't marry your past, Samuel. I married the man you had become." He covered her hand with his own, grateful for her steadiness, even as his world tilted toward chaos. Margaret was everything a man could want in a wife: loyal, intelligent, graceful. But she was not Catherine, and the daughter waiting by the oak tree was not the child she would have given him. "I know," he said, "and I'm grateful for that every day." She kissed his cheek and left him alone with his thoughts and the weight of decisions that would change everything. Samuel returned to his desk and opened the drawer again, this time withdrawing his leather journal. The first entry was dated 3 months after the fire, written in shaky handwriting that betrayed his emotional state. "Catherine is gone. Anna is gone. I am alone in the world, and I do not know how to continue breathing." The pages that followed chronicled his descent into despair, his desperate search for survivors, and finally his decision to head west and start over. Reading his own words after so many years, Samuel could feel the raw agony of that younger man, could remember the nights when he had prayed to join his family rather than face another sunrise without them. But now Sarah was alive, grown into a woman who needed his help. The daughter he had grieved was asking him to step back into the light, to use the power and wealth he had accumulated to protect the people who had given her a second chance at life. The question was whether Samuel Clayton, successful cattle baron, was brave enough to risk everything he had built for the daughter he thought he had lost forever. By late afternoon, Samuel could no longer resist the pull toward the south pasture. He saddled his black stallion Neptune and rode out under the pretense of checking fence lines, though his true destination was the ancient oak tree where his daughter waited. As he approached, he could see her camp was sparse but efficient. A small lean-to, constructed from branches and hide, provided shelter, while a carefully contained fire sent thin smoke into the crisp air. Sarah sat cross-legged beside the flames, working on what appeared to be a piece of leather with bone tools. She looked up as he dismounted, showing no surprise at his arrival. "Figured you'd come sooner or later." "I had to see if you were real," Samuel said, tethering Neptune to a low branch. "Part of me hoped this morning was just a dream." Sarah set aside her work and studied him with those unsettling, familiar eyes. "Disappointing to find out your dead daughter is alive." "That's not what I meant." Samuel settled onto a fallen log across from her fire. "It's just seeing you like this. It's hard to reconcile with the little girl I remember." "That little girl died in the fire, same as Mama," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "What crawled out of those woods was something different." She reached into her pack and withdrew a hand-drawn map on what looked like deer hide. The markings were precise despite the primitive medium, showing mountain passes, water sources, and settlements marked with small symbols. "This is where I've lived for the past 25 years, she said, pointing to a cluster of symbols in the high country. Hidden Valley, the mountain folk call it. Protected by cliffs and accessible only through 3 narrow passes. 43 souls living the old way, taking only what the land gives freely." Samuel studied the map, noting how the territory overlapped with the northern boundaries of his own property. "I had no idea anyone lived up there. The terrain looks impossible." "It's hard country," Sarah agreed. "But it's free country, or it was until the developers showed up with their papers and their threats." She pulled out another document, this one on official territorial letterhead. Samuel recognized the seal and the signature territorial judge Harrison Wells, a man he had dined with on several occasions. "Wells signed this?" Samuel asked, reading the eviction notice with growing alarm. "This is highly irregular. Usually there's a hearing, a chance to present claims. Mountain folk don't have lawyers or fancy papers," Sarah said bitterly. "We have the right of occupation, nothing more. Been living peaceful up there for decades, bothering nobody, taking care of the land. But apparently that's not enough when somebody wants what you have." Samuel folded the notice and handed it back. "What exactly do they want? That land is practically worthless, too high for farming, too remote for cattle." Sarah's expression grew grim. "That's what we thought too, until the men with the measuring instruments showed up. Seems there's something under our mountains that's worth more than all the cattle in Wyoming. Minerals. Silver. A lot of it, according to the surveyors who've been poking around." She fed another stick to the fire, watching the flames dance. "Enough to make whoever controls it very wealthy. Wealthy enough to buy judges and territorial officials, apparently." The implications settled over Samuel like a cold wind. Land grabs were common enough in the territories, but this sounded organized, well-funded. Someone with serious resources was orchestrating the removal of Sarah's community, and they had enough influence to manipulate the legal system. "Who's behind it?" he asked. "Company called Mountain Development Corporation. Heard of them?" Samuel frowned. The name was vaguely familiar, though he could not place where he had heard it. "I'll need to make some inquiries, find out who's really pulling the strings." Sarah nodded, then reached into her pack again. This time she withdrew a small object, wrapped in soft cloth. When she unwrapped it, Samuel's breath caught in his throat. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age but still recognizable. He had given it to Catherine on their first wedding anniversary, had watched her wear it every day until the fire claimed her. Inside, he knew, was a tiny photograph of the three of them, Samuel, Catherine, and baby Anatican, by a traveling photographer, when Anna was just 2 years old. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "Found it in Mama's hand when Joseph and Marie pulled me from the creek," Sarah said softly. "She must have grabbed it when the fire started. I've worn it every day since I was old enough to understand what it meant." With careful fingers, Sarah opened the locket. The photograph was faded and water-stained, but the faces were still visible. Samuel saw himself as he had been 25 years ago, younger, hopeful, with an arm around Catherine's waist and little Anna perched on his knee. They looked happy in that frozen moment, unaware that their time together was so brief. "I used to stare at this picture and try to remember your voice," Sarah said. "Marie would tell me stories about fathers and daughters, but all I had was this image and the doll you made. For years, I wondered if you were even real or just something I had dreamed." Samuel felt tears threatening for the first time in decades. The successful cattle baron, the respected businessman, the carefully controlled man he had become, all of it crumbled in the face of this impossible reunion. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but necessary. "I should have looked longer, should have found you somehow." "You couldn't have known," Sarah replied, "and I understand why you had to leave. The grief would have killed you if you'd stayed." She closed the locket and returned it to her pack. "But I'm not here for apologies or explanations. I'm here because my people need help, and you're the only family I have who might be able to provide it." Samuel stood and walked to where Neptune waited patiently. The horse sensed his agitation, shifting restlessly and nickering softly. "I need time to think about this, to figure out what can be done." "Time is something we don't have much of," Sarah said. "Those developers aren't waiting for anyone's convenience." 3 days, Samuel said, echoing her earlier words. "You said you'd give me 3 days." Sarah nodded. 3 days, but Samuel Papa, if you decide you can't help us, I'll understand. You've built a new life here, and I won't ask you to destroy it for the sake of a past you tried to forget. As Samuel rode back toward the ranch house, the weight of Sarah's words settled deep in his chest. She was giving him permission to walk away, to choose his comfortable present over the dangerous truth of his past. But as the silver locket's image burned in his memory, He wondered if he had any choice at all. The daughter he thought he had lost was asking for his help. The question was whether the man he had become was worthy of the father she remembered. The next morning found Samuel in town, conducting inquiries with the careful precision of a man accustomed to getting answers. His first stop was the Territorial Land Office, where clerk Benjamin Foster had served for nearly 15 years. If anyone understood the legal maneuvering behind the mountain evictions, it would be Foster. Mountain Development Corporation? Foster repeated, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Oh yes, they've been quite busy lately, filed more land claims in the past 6 months than we usually see in 2 years. Samuel leaned against the counter, adopting the casual demeanor of a fellow businessman making conversation. Sounds like they're expanding rapidly. Who's the principal owner? Foster consulted a thick ledger, running his finger down columns of entries. Interesting you should ask. The registered agent is a lawyer from Denver, but the actual ownership is held by something called Western Investment Partners. Very secretive operation. Any names you recognize? Well, Foster lowered his voice conspiratorially. I probably shouldn't say this, but there have been rumors. Word is that several prominent territorial businessmen are involved. Men with enough influence to expedite certain legal processes, if you understand my meaning. Samuel understood perfectly. In the territories, justice often moved at the speed of money and political connections. What about Judge Wells? He signed the eviction orders pretty quickly. Foster's expression grew uncomfortable. Judge Wells has been quite accommodating to Mountain Development's requests. Some folks are saying maybe too accommodating, but who am I to question a territorial judge? Samuel left the land office with more questions than answers, but a clearer picture of what Sarah's community was facing. This was not a simple land dispute between settlers and squatters. Someone with serious resources and political connections wanted that mountain territory badly enough to manipulate the legal system. His next stop was the First Bank of Wyoming, where President Marcus Whitman had been handling Samuel's business affairs for over a decade. Whitman was a cautious man who kept his ear to the ground regarding territorial business dealings. "Samuel," Whitman greeted him warmly, rising from behind his mahogany desk. "What brings you to town on a Wednesday?" "Curiosity about some recent business developments," Samuel replied, accepting the offered chair. "Ever heard of Mountain Development Corporation?" Whitman's friendly expression grew guarded. "Why do you ask?" "They're acquiring land north of my property. I'm wondering if it might affect cattle access to water sources up there." "I see." Whitman returned to his chair, clearly choosing his words carefully. "They're a well-funded operation, I can tell you that much. Made some substantial deposits recently, all cash transactions, very professional, very discreet. Any idea where the funding originates?" "Samuel, you know I can't discuss other clients' business in detail, but I will say this, Mountain Development has the kind of backing that suggests serious, long-term plans for this region." Samuel recognized the diplomatic evasion. Whitman knew more than he was saying, but professional discretion prevented him from being more direct. Still, the information was useful. Someone with access to large amounts of cash was orchestrating the mountain land grab, and they were confident enough in their legal position to move quickly. On his ride home, Samuel stopped at the small cemetery where Catherine and Anna were supposed to rest. He had erected a modest headstone years ago, more for his own peace of mind than because he believed their remains lay beneath the Wyoming soil. Now, standing before the granite marker, he felt the weight of 25 years of misdirected grief. "Catherine," he said softly, removing his hat, "our little girl is alive. She's grown into a woman I barely recognize, but she's alive." The wind rustled through the cottonwood trees, the only response to his words. "I don't know what to do. She needs help, but helping her means risking everything we built here. Everything I built for you, to honor your memory." A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the empty grassland. Samuel had always found peace in this place, but today it felt hollow, marked by the knowledge that his grief had been based on an incomplete truth. When he arrived back at the ranch, Margaret was waiting on the porch with an expression that suggested she had reached the end of her patience with his mysterious behavior. "Thomas said you rode out early without breakfast," she said as he climbed the steps. "And yesterday you barely touched your dinner. Samuel, what's happening?" He sat beside her on the porch swing, studying the woman who had been his anchor for 12 years. Margaret deserved better than half-truths and evasion, but the full truth felt too dangerous to share. "The visitor yesterday," he began carefully, "brought news about some people in trouble. Mountain folk up north are being forced off their land by developers." "That's terrible, but what does it have to do with you?" Samuel took a deep breath. "The person who came to Mesh is someone I once knew very well, someone I thought I'd lost forever." Margaret's green eyes searched his face. "A woman from your past?" "Yes, but not what you're thinking." Samuel took Margaret's hand, needing the anchor of her touch. She was family. Family I thought had died in the fire that drove me west." The words hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they should cross. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "Family," she repeated slowly. "What kind of family, Samuel?" Before he could answer, Thomas appeared in the doorway with a concerned expression. "Mr. Clayton, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says it's urgent business regarding Mountain Development Corporation." Samuel felt his blood chill. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Someone had been watching his movements, tracking his inquiries around town. Margaret's hand tightened in his as she sensed his tension. "Show him to my study," Samuel said, rising from the swing. "I'll be right there." After Thomas disappeared into the house, Margaret caught Samuel's arm. "What aren't you telling me? This woman from your past, who is she really?" Samuel looked into his wife's eyes and saw the fear there, the recognition that their carefully ordered world was about to change dramatically. "Her name is Sarah," he said quietly, "and she's my daughter." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She released his arm and stepped back, her face pale with shock. "Your daughter? But you said you told me you had no family, that everyone you loved had died." "I believe that was true," Samuel said desperately. "The fire took everything, my wife, my child, my home. I saw the ruins, searched for survivors. There was nothing left but ashes and grief." "Your wife?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "You were married before." 25 years ago, Catherine died in the fire, but somehow Anna Sarah survived. She was raised by mountain people who found her wandering in the woods. Margaret sat down heavily on the porch swing, her composure finally cracking. 25 years. All this time you had a daughter out there, and you never told me." "I thought she was dead, Margaret. I grieved for her every day until I met you. You gave me a reason to stop looking backward, to build something new." "But now she's here," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "And she wants something from you, something that threatens what we have." Samuel wanted to deny it, but the truth was too obvious to ignore. Sarah's presence did threaten their comfortable life, their carefully maintained respectability. Helping her would mean exposing his past, admitting to lies of omission, and potentially making enemies of powerful people. "The gentleman is waiting, sir," Thomas called from inside. Samuel looked at Margaret one more time, seeing the questions and hurt in her eyes. "We'll finish this conversation later, but Margaret, whatever happens, know that what we have is real. You saved me from a darkness I thought would never end." Inside his study, a tall man in an expensive suit stood examining the maps on Samuel's wall. He turned as Samuel entered, extending a manicured hand in greeting. "Mr. Clayton, thank you for seeing me. My name is Charles Brennan, legal counsel for Mountain Development Corporation." Samuel shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and calculating eyes. "What can I do for you, Mr. Brennan?" "I understand you've been making inquiries about our business operations. I thought it might be beneficial for us to speak directly, avoid any misunderstandings." "I'm always interested in development that might affect my property," Samuel said carefully. "Your company has been quite active in the high country lately." Brennan smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed we have. We're bringing progress to areas that have remained primitive for far too long." Imagine the benefits jobs, infrastructure, economic growth for the entire territory. And displacing the people who already live there? A few mountain hermits squatting on valuable land? Brennan waved dismissively. They'll be compensated fairly and relocated to more suitable areas. Everyone benefits. Samuel studied the lawyer's confident demeanor. What if they refuse to leave? They won't have a choice, Brennan said simply. The law is quite clear on the matter. We have proper documentation, territorial backing, and the full authority of Judge Wells. Any resistance would be both futile and illegal. The threat was delivered politely, but unmistakably. Samuel realized he was being warned to stay out of Mountain Development's affairs, that his inquiries had been noted and were unwelcome. I appreciate your directness, Samuel said, but I'm curious, why come to me personally? Surely my interest in your operations is minimal. Brennan's smile grew sharper. Perhaps because a concerned citizen was seen visiting one of the squatters yesterday evening. We'd hate for such a respected member of the community to become inadvertently involved in an unfortunate situation. The message was clear. They knew about Sarah, knew about his visit to her camp. Samuel felt a chill of genuine fear, not for himself but for his daughter. These people were playing a serious game, with serious stakes, and they would not hesitate to remove obstacles. I understand your position, Samuel said evenly. Thank you for clarifying the situation. Excellent. Brennan moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Clayton, your business partnership with Harrison Wells has been quite profitable over the years, hasn't it? It would be unfortunate if anything disrupted such a beneficial relationship. After Brennan left, Samuel stood alone in his study, the weight of the threat settling over him like a shroud. Judge Wells was not just the official who had signed the eviction order, he was Samuel's business partner in several cattle ventures. The connection ran deeper than he had realized, and the implications were staggering. Someone had done their homework on Samuel Clayton, mapping his relationships and vulnerabilities with disturbing precision. They knew about Sarah, knew about his business connections, and were prepared to use both against him. The question was no longer whether he could help his daughter. The question was whether he could afford not to. That evening, Samuel sat alone in his study with a bottle of whiskey and a collection of letters he had never intended anyone to see. They were arranged chronologically on his desk, dozens of them, written over the years, but never sent, all addressed to Catherine and Anna, conversations with the dead that had helped him process his grief and guilt. The first letter, dated just 6 months after the fire, was barely legible through water stains that were not from rain. My dearest Catherine and sweet Anna, it began, I am lost without you. Every sunrise feels like a betrayal, every breath an insult to your memory. The letters chronicled his journey west, his struggles to rebuild, and eventually his meeting with Margaret. Reading them now, Samuel could trace the evolution of his healing, the gradual acceptance that life could continue even after losing everything that mattered. One letter, written 3 years after meeting Margaret, stood out. I think you would like her, Catherine. She has your kindness, your way of seeing beauty in simple things. I hope you understand that loving her doesn't mean forgetting you. The study door opened softly, and Margaret entered carrying a tea service. She had changed from her day dress into a simple robe, her graying auburn hair loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed but determined. I thought you might be hungry, she said, setting the tray on a side table. You missed dinner again. Samuel looked up from the letters, seeing the pain in his wife's face. Margaret, I'm sorry. I know this is difficult to understand. Show me, she said simply. What? The letters. I can see they're personal. Show me who you were before I knew you. Samuel hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from his desk. Margaret settled herself and waited with the patience that had always been one of her greatest strengths. These are letters I wrote to my first family, Samuel said, his voice rough with whiskey and emotion. Conversations I needed to have but couldn't because I thought they were dead. He handed her the first letter, watching as she read it carefully. Her expression softened as she absorbed the raw grief in his younger self's words. Oh, Samuel, she whispered, You were in such pain. For years, he admitted. The guilt nearly destroyed me. I was away on business when the fire started, a cattle deal that seemed so important at the time. If I had been home, maybe I could have saved them. Margaret continued reading, moving through the chronological progression of his healing. When she reached the letter about meeting her, tears began flowing down her cheeks. You wrote this about me. 3 years after we met, I was struggling with whether it was fair to you to build a relationship when my heart was still so broken. But you never sent these letters, never told me about them. Samuel refilled his whiskey glass, needing the courage alcohol provided. I was afraid you'd think less of me, that you'd see me as damaged goods, a man who could never love you completely because part of him was still buried with his first family. Margaret set the letter aside and moved to the window, looking out at the darkened landscape. And now she's alive, your daughter is alive, and she needs your help. Yes, and helping her means exposing everything you've hidden. Our friends, our community will learn that Samuel Clayton wasn't who they thought he was. Samuel nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Margaret turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. What did that lawyer want today? To warn me off. Mountain Development knows I've been asking questions, knows about Sarah. They're prepared to use our business connections against us if I interfere. How deeply are we connected to this Judge Wells? Samuel winced. Deeper than I realized. He's a partner in 3 of our major cattle ventures. If he turns against us, we could lose a significant portion of our wealth. And if you help your daughter, we definitely will. They'll destroy us financially and socially. Everything we've built here will be gone. Margaret returned to her chair, studying Samuel with the analytical mind that had made her such an effective partner in building their empire. What kind of woman is she? Your daughter? Samuel considered the question carefully. Strong, harder than the little girl I remember, shaped by 25 years of mountain living. But there's something in her eyes, a goodness that survived everything she's endured. Does she know about me? I haven't told her about our marriage. I wasn't sure how to explain that I'd moved on, built a new life. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. She probably assumes you've been alone all these years, grieving for her and her mother. Probably. Which means when she learns the truth about our marriage, she'll feel like she's asking you to choose between your old family and your new one. Samuel had not considered that angle, but Margaret was right. To Sarah, his comfortable life with Margaret might seem like a betrayal of the family she represented. The daughter who had survived against impossible odds might not understand how her father had found happiness while believing her dead. What do you want me to do? Samuel asked quietly. Margaret stood and walked to his desk, gathering the letters into a neat stack. I want you to help her, she said firmly. I want you to be the father she deserves, even if it costs us everything. Samuel stared at his wife in amazement. Margaret, you don't understand what that means. We could lose the ranch, our position in society, our financial security. I understand perfectly. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. But I also understand what it means to live with regret. You spent 25 years believing your daughter was dead, and that guilt nearly destroyed you. Now you have a chance to make things right, to be the man she needs you to be. She moved behind his chair and placed her hands on his shoulders. I didn't marry Samuel Clayton, the successful cattle baron. I married Samuel Clayton, the man broken, grieving, but fundamentally good. That man would never abandon his daughter when she needed him most. Samuel reached up to cover her hands with his own. And if we lose everything, then we'll rebuild. We did it once before. We can do it again. But Samuel, if you turn your back on her now, if you choose comfort over family, you'll never forgive yourself. And eventually, you'll resent me for being the reason you made that choice. The wisdom in her words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Margaret was right. Abandoning Sarah to protect their lifestyle would poison everything good between them. The guilt would eat away at their marriage until nothing remained but bitterness and regret. I love you, he said simply. I know, and I love you. That's why we're going to help her, whatever the cost. Samuel stood and pulled Margaret into his arms, holding her close as the weight of decision settled over them. Tomorrow, he would ride to Sarah's camp and tell her that Samuel Clayton was ready to fight for his daughter and her mountain family. Tonight, he would hold his wife and be grateful for the kind of love that made sacrifice feel like privilege. Samuel rode to Sarah's camp at dawn, carrying supplies and a heart heavy with determination. He found her breaking down her temporary shelter, preparing to move on as she had promised. "I was beginning to think you'd decided against helping us," she said, not looking up from her work. "I've decided to help," Samuel said, dismounting. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs." Sarah straightened, studying his face for signs of doubt. "It'll cost you plenty. These people don't play fair." "I'm beginning to understand that. But first, I need to know exactly what we're up against." Samuel pulled a rolled document from his saddlebag. "I had my lawyer do some research on Mountain Development Corporation." Sarah accepted the papers, her expression growing darker as she read. The document revealed a complex web of shell companies and hidden investors, but one name stood out prominently near the end. "Harrison Wells," she read aloud. "Your business partner is more than just a judge signing papers. He's one of the primary investors in the company trying to steal our land." Samuel nodded grimly. "It gets worse. My lawyer found surveyor reports dating back 8 months. They've known about the silver deposits much longer than they've let on. This entire operation was planned well in advance." Sarah continued reading, her face growing pale. "Samuel Papa, there's something else here. Something about the original survey team." "What about them?" "Look at the date of the first geological report." Sarah pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. "March 15th, 1874. But the surveyor's signature, it's someone named Clayton, J. Clayton." Samuel felt the world shift beneath his feet. "That's impossible." "Is it? How common is your name around here?" Sarah's voice carried a mixture of anger and betrayal. "Did you know about the silver? Is that why you really came to Wyoming Territory?" "No," Samuel said desperately. "I came here to escape the past, to start over. I knew nothing about any silver deposits." But even as he spoke, fragments of memory began surfacing. His brother Jacob had been a surveyor back in Missouri, had talked about opportunities in the Western Territories. Jacob, who had disappeared just before the fire, who had left behind debts and angry creditors. "My brother," Samuel whispered. "Jacob was a surveyor, but he died years ago, back in Missouri." Sarah's expression hardened. "Are you sure about that? Because according to this report, J. Clayton filed claims on mineral rights throughout this region. Claims that were quietly transferred to Mountain Development Corporation 6 months ago." The implications crashed over Samuel like an avalanche. If Jacob was alive, if he had been surveying these mountains for years, then his brother had known exactly where Samuel had settled. The coincidence of Sarah's community being threatened on land so close to Samuel's ranch was not coincidence at all. "We need to see those original claim documents," Samuel said, his mind racing. "If Jacob filed them, there might be information about why he never contacted me." Sarah was already packing her remaining gear. "The Territorial Land Office keeps copies of all mineral claims, but Samuel, if your brother is involved in this, it changes everything. This isn't just about greedy developers anymore." They rode hard toward town, Samuel's thoughts churning with possibilities he did not want to consider. Jacob had always been the clever one, the schemer who saw opportunities where others saw only problems. If he was behind Mountain Development Corporation, then this land grab was personal, in ways Samuel was only beginning to understand. At the land office, Clerk Benjamin Foster was reluctant to pull historical files until Samuel mentioned that the surveyor in question might be his brother. Foster's curiosity overcame his bureaucratic caution. J. Clayton filed claims on over 40,000 acres of mountain territory, Foster said, spreading the documents across his desk. Very thorough work, with detailed geological assessments. He clearly knew what he was looking for. Samuel studied his brother's familiar handwriting on the claim forms. Jacob's signature was unmistakable, as was his methodical approach to documenting potential mineral wealth. But what struck Samuel most was the date of the final claim filed, just 3 months after Samuel's arrival in Wyoming Territory. "He knew where I was," Samuel said quietly. "He's known for over 20 years, and he never said a word." Sarah leaned over his shoulder, reading the documents. "There's more. Look at the witness signatures on these claims." Samuel followed her finger to the bottom of the page, where 2 names were scrawled in different handwriting. One was unfamiliar, but the other made his blood run cold. "Harrison Wells," he read. "Wells witnessed Jacob's claims 20 years ago. Which means Judge Wells has known about your connection to this family for decades," Sarah said. "Every business deal you've made with him, every social interaction, he's been watching you, waiting for the right moment to use this information." The clerk Foster cleared his throat nervously. "There's something else you should know about these claims. They include detailed maps of water sources, mountain passes, and," he hesitated, glancing between Samuel and Sarah, "locations of existing settlements." Samuel felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Jacob had not only surveyed the mineral wealth of Sarah's mountain home, he had mapped the community itself, documented the people living there, and provided Mountain Development Corporation with everything they needed to plan their forced removal. "He's been watching Sarah's people for years," Samuel said, "planning this operation, waiting for the right time to move." Sarah's face had gone white with rage. "My adoptive parents, the children in our community, they're all in his files. He's been studying us like specimens, learning our weaknesses." Samuel stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "We need to warn your people. If Jacob has been planning this for years, he knows things about your community that you might not expect." As they left the land office, Samuel's mind reeled with the betrayal. His own brother, the family member he had grieved almost as much as his wife and daughter, was alive and orchestrating an attack on the daughter Jacob must know had survived. The personal nature of this conspiracy went beyond simple greed. "Sarah," Samuel said, as they mounted their horses, "there's something you need to understand about Jacob. He always held grudges, never forgave perceived slights. If he blames me for abandoning the family back in Missouri, he might see destroying your mountain community as punishment." "Punishment for what?" Samuel's voice was heavy with old guilt. "For surviving when Catherine died. For building a new life instead of joining her in the grave. Jacob never understood how I could move on after losing everything." Sarah stared at him with those familiar blue eyes, now filled with a terrible understanding. "He's not just after the silver, he's after you. And he's using my people as bait to force you into a choice." As they rode toward the mountains, Samuel realized that the stakes had become impossibly personal. This was not just about saving Sarah's community from greedy developers. This was about confronting a brother who had been planning revenge for 25 years, using the daughter Samuel thought was dead as the ultimate weapon in a family war Samuel had never known was being fought. The ride to Hidden Valley took them through terrain that grew progressively more rugged and isolated. Samuel found himself marveling at Sarah's knowledge of the mountain passes, her ability to find paths that seemed to exist only in her memory. This was her world, shaped by 25 years of survival in conditions that would have broken most people. "Tell me about the community," Samuel said as they paused to rest the horses beside a crystal-clear stream. "What am I walking into?" Sarah dismounted and knelt by the water, cupping her hands to drink. 43 people, ranging from old Marie, who found me in the woods, to children born just last spring. We're not all blood relatives, but we're family in every way that matters." She splashed water on her face, washing away the dust of hard travel. "Joseph leads the Council of Elders, makes the big decisions. He's the closest thing to a father I've known since losing you. Marie is our healer, knows more about mountain plants and their properties than any doctor you'll find in your towns below." "And they all know about me? About who I am?" Sarah nodded. "Marie always said my eyes held memories of a man who loved me. When I finally pieced together your story, she wasn't surprised. Mountain people understand that the past has a way of finding you when you least expect it." They climbed higher, following a narrow trail that hugged the cliff face. Below them, the world fell away into misty valleys and distant peaks. Samuel understood why someone might choose to live up here, away from the complications and compromises of civilization. There was a purity to this place, a sense of being closer to something eternal. "What's our strategy?" Samuel asked, as they crested a ridge that offered their first view of Hidden Valley. The settlement spread below them was unlike anything Samuel had expected. Instead of rough cabins and temporary shelters, he saw carefully constructed homes built into the natural landscape. Gardens terraced into the hillsides, water channeled from mountain springs, and a central area that served as a meeting place for the community. These people had not simply survived in the mountains, they had thrived. "First, we convince the council that you're here to help, not to judge," Sarah said. "Some of them have had bad experiences with valley folk. They'll be suspicious of a wealthy rancher showing up with promises. And if they accept my help, then we figure out how to fight Jacob and his corporation. They have money and legal backing, but we know these mountains better than anyone. If it comes to a physical confrontation, the terrain is on our side." Sarah led him down a switchbacking trail toward the valley floor. As they descended, Samuel could see people emerging from their homes, alerted by lookouts who had spotted their approach. Men and women, children and elders, all watching with the careful attention of people who had learned that strangers could bring either salvation or destruction. At the center of the settlement stood a large man with silver hair and weathered features that spoke of decades in the high country. This had to be Joseph, the leader Sarah had described. Beside him stood an elderly woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing Marie, the healer who had saved Sarah's life all those years ago. "Joseph, Marie," Sarah called out as they dismounted, "I've brought the help I promised." Samuel removed his hat, feeling awkward in his fine clothes among these people who wore practical buckskin and homespun. "I'm Samuel Clayton," he said simply, "Sarah's father." Joseph stepped forward, studying Samuel with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading character quickly and accurately. "You have her eyes," he said finally. "Marie always said she got them from her blood father." Marie approached more cautiously, her gaze moving between Samuel and Sarah. "You're the one who came from the fire?" "Yes, ma'am. I thought she had died with her mother. If I had known—" "The past is the past," Marie said with the firmness of someone who had lived long enough to understand the futility of regret. "What matters is what you're willing to do now." Sarah showed Samuel to a simple guest lodge where he could leave his horse and belongings. The accommodations were sparse but clean, reflecting the mountain community's approach to life, everything necessary, nothing wasted. As evening approached, the community gathered in the central meeting area. Samuel found himself the center of attention as Sarah explained what they had discovered about Mountain Development Corporation and the connection to Jacob Clayton. "So this isn't just about the silver," Joseph said, his voice grave. "This is family business that's spilled over onto our land." "I'm afraid so," Samuel admitted. "My brother apparently sees your community as a way to hurt me. I'm sorry you've been caught in the middle of something that has nothing to do with you." An older man with a scarred face and missing fingers spoke up. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Clayton, but it has everything to do with us now. These developers want our homes, our way of life. Whether it's about money or family revenge doesn't matter to our children who'll be homeless." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Samuel realized he was being tested, evaluated not just as Sarah's father, but as a potential ally in a fight for survival. "You're right," Samuel said, standing to address the group. "This is your fight now, regardless of how it started. The question is whether you'll accept help from someone whose family problems brought this trouble to your door." Joseph exchanged glances with the other elders, then nodded slowly. "Sarah says you have influence in the valley, connections that might help us fight this legal battle." "I do, but using those connections will cost me everything I've built down there. My business partnerships, my social standing, probably my wealth. Is that a price you're comfortable asking me to pay?" Marie stood, her aged voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of wisdom and service. "Young man," she said, and Samuel realized that despite his 50-plus years, he would always be young to someone who had lived through as much as Marie had. The price of doing what's right is never too high. The price of doing what's wrong is always more than you can afford. The simple truth of her words settled over the gathering like a benediction. Samuel felt the weight of decision lifting from his shoulders, replaced by the clarity that came from knowing exactly what had to be done. "Then we fight," he said. "But we fight smart. Jacob has had years to plan this operation, but he's made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" Sarah asked. Samuel looked around at the faces surrounding him, weathered by mountain life, but united in their determination to protect their home. He underestimated what people will do to protect their family, all of their family. Over the next several hours, they developed a strategy that combined Samuel's knowledge of legal and business tactics with the mountain community's understanding of their territory and its defenses. If Jacob and Mountain Development Corporation wanted a fight, they would get one, but it would be fought on terms they had not anticipated. As the meeting broke up and people drifted back to their homes, Samuel found himself alone with Sarah beside the dying fire. The stars overhead were brighter than anything he could see from his ranch, unmarred by the light and smoke of civilization. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked quietly. Samuel thought about Margaret waiting for him at the ranch, about the comfortable life he was about to sacrifice, about the brother who had become his enemy. "I've been ready for 25 years, he said. "I just didn't know it." Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would determine the fate of Hidden Valley and everyone who called it home. Tonight, Samuel Clayton, father, husband, and reluctant warrior, prepared for the most important battle of his life. Dawn came early to Hidden Valley, bringing with it the sound of approaching horses. Samuel stood with Joseph and Sarah on the ridge, overlooking the main trail, watching a procession of men in business suits wind their way up the mountain path. At their head rode two figures. Samuel recognized Judge Harrison Wells, and a man who, despite 25 years of separation, was unmistakably his brother Jacob. 12 men, Joseph observed, lowering his spyglass, half of them armed. "They're not expecting much resistance," Sarah said grimly. "They think mountain folk will roll over when faced with official papers and legal threats." Samuel studied his brother through the spyglass, noting how prosperity had changed Jacob's appearance. Where Samuel remembered a lean, hungry young man, he now saw someone soft with comfortable living, his surveyor's practical clothes replaced by fine Eastern garments that marked him as a man of substance. "He looks different," Samuel murmured. 25 years of plotting revenge will change a man," Sarah replied. "The question is whether he's still the brother you remember underneath all that anger." The delegation reached the valley floor and formed a semicircle in the central meeting area. Jacob dismounted with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to hard riding, while Judge Wells remained horsed, using his elevated position to project authority over the assembled mountain people. Samuel, Sarah, and Joseph approached from the main trail, having descended from their observation point. As they drew closer, Samuel could see recognition dawning in Jacob's eyes, followed quickly by a mixture of triumph and something that might have been regret. "Hello, Samuel," Jacob said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of education and refinement. "You look well. Prosperity agrees with you." "Jacob." Samuel stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see the details of his brother's face, but far enough to avoid any appearance of intimidation. "I thought you were dead, as I thought you were for a while. Funny how the truth has a way of surfacing eventually." Jacob's smile was sharp, predatory. "I see you've met my niece. She's grown into quite the mountain woman, hasn't she?" Judge Wells cleared his throat impatiently. "Perhaps we could dispense with the family reunion and focus on the business at hand. These people have been served with legal eviction notices. They have 30 days to vacate this territory." "On what grounds?" Joseph stepped forward, his calm demeanor masking the steel beneath. "We've lived here peacefully for decades, harming no one." Wells produced a thick folder of documents. on the grounds that you are illegally occupying territory that belongs to Mountain Development Corporation. We have proper mineral rights claims, territorial backing, and the full force of law behind our position." Samuel moved closer to his brother, studying the man Jacob had become. "Impressive operation, Jacob. Very thorough, very professional. How long have you been planning this?" "Since the day I learned you had survived the fire and run west like a coward," Jacob replied, his voice hardening. "Since I realized you had abandoned not just the graves of your family, but the responsibilities you owed to the living." "What responsibilities? You disappeared months before the fire. I thought you were dead too." Jacob's laugh was bitter. "I disappeared because creditors were after me, Samuel, because I had debts I couldn't pay and enemies I couldn't face. I thought my big brother would help me, would use some of that precious integrity everyone admired to stand by his family. I never knew you needed help. You never asked." "I shouldn't have had to ask." Jacob's composure cracked, revealing the anger that had been festering for decades. "You were building your perfect little life with Catherine and Anna, playing the respectable businessman while your own brother was drowning in debt and desperation." Samuel felt the pieces clicking into place. "So when the fire happened, when I lost everything, you saw it as justice, as punishment for not being the brother you needed." "I saw it as an opportunity," Jacob said, his voice growing cold again. "When I learned you had survived and fled west, I decided to give you a choice. Live with the consequences of abandoning family, or watch me destroy the new family you thought you'd found." Sarah stepped between the brothers, her presence a physical reminder of what was at stake. "And 43 innocent people are just tools in your family revenge?" Jacob's gaze shifted to his niece, and for a moment his expression softened. "You were never supposed to be involved in this, Anna. When I learned you had survived, that you were living with these mountain people, I thought about abandoning the whole plan." "But you didn't," Sarah said simply. "No, because I realized this was perfect justice. Samuel abandoned his family obligations once. Now he gets to choose whether to do it again, his comfortable life with his new wife, or the daughter he thought was dead, and the people who raised her." Judge Wells interrupted impatiently. "Fascinating as this family drama may be, we have legal business to conduct. These people will vacate this territory within 30 days, or they will be removed by force." Joseph had been listening to the exchange with growing understanding. "You're using the law as a weapon," he said to Wells, "twisting justice to serve a personal vendetta." "I'm enforcing legitimate property rights," Wells replied. "The fact that it serves multiple purposes is simply efficient." Samuel realized the moment of decision had arrived. Everything he had built, every relationship he valued, every comfortable certainty of his life hung in the balance. Jacob was watching him with predatory intensity, waiting to see if his carefully laid trap would finally spring. "Jacob," Samuel said quietly, "what will it take to end this? What do you really want from me?" His brother's smile was triumphant. "I want you to choose, Samuel, your wealth and respectability, or your daughter and her mountain family. Give up everything you've built since abandoning us. Admit publicly that Samuel Clayton is a fraud who built his fortune on lies, and I'll call off the eviction. And if I refuse, then these people lose their homes, and you lose your daughter all over again. Only this time, it will be your choice, not fate's." The silence stretched across the valley, broken only by the wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk. Samuel could feel the weight of every eye upon him, the mountain community waiting to learn whether their faith in him had been misplaced. Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, his last will and testament, hastily revised the night before with the help of the community's educated members. "There's a third option, Jacob, one you didn't consider." "What's that?" "I choose both." Samuel handed the document to Judge Wells. "This transfers ownership of my ranch, my cattle, and all my business interests to the Hidden Valley Community Trust. Every acre, every asset, everything I've built becomes theirs to use in defending this land." Jacob's face went white. "That's impossible." You can't just give away a fortune. Actually, he can, Wells said, scanning the document with growing alarm. This appears to be legally binding, witnessed, notarized, and filed with the territorial clerk this morning. Samuel smiled grimly. One of the advantages of having friends in town, Jacob. Amazing what can be accomplished when people believe in your cause. You're bluffing, Jacob snarled. You wouldn't destroy everything you've worked for. Wouldn't I? Samuel turned to address the mountain community. Joseph, Marie, all of you, I hereby transfer ownership of the Clayton Ranch and all its assets to your community. Use it to fight this legal battle, to secure your rights to this land, and to build a future for your children. The delegation from Mountain Development Corporation was in chaos. Judge Wells was frantically reading the legal documents, trying to find some flaw that would invalidate them. Jacob was staring at his brother with a mixture of rage and disbelief, realizing that his carefully planned revenge had backfired spectacularly. "This changes nothing," Jacob shouted. "We still have the law on our side, still have the territorial backing." "Actually," came a new voice from the ridge above, "you don't." All eyes turned upward to see Margaret Clayton riding down the trail, accompanied by 3 men in official territorial uniforms. Samuel felt his heart stop as he recognized the lead rider, Territorial Governor William Hayes, a man Samuel had met socially but never expected to see in Hidden Valley. Margaret dismounted with practiced grace, her presence transforming the rough mountain setting. She was dressed for travel, but still managed to project the dignity and authority that came from her Eastern upbringing and social position. "Governor Hayes," Samuel said, moving to help his wife down from her horse. "This is unexpected. Mrs. Clayton contacted me last night." Hayes replied, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "She presented some very interesting information about irregularities in certain territorial land claims." Jacob's face had gone from white to gray. "What kind of irregularities?" Hayes withdrew a thick folder from his saddlebag. "The kind that suggests systematic fraud in the filing of mineral rights claims. Claims that were backdated, witnessed by people who weren't present, and approved through channels that appear to have been compromised." "That's preposterous," Wells blustered. "I witnessed those claims personally." "According to our investigation, Judge Wells, you witnessed claims on dates when territorial records show you were presiding over court cases 300 miles away. Unless you've developed the ability to be in 2 places at once, those witnessing signatures are fraudulent." The trap was closing around Jacob and his conspirators with beautiful precision. Samuel looked at Margaret with amazement, realizing that while he had been preparing for a mountain battle, his wife had been fighting a legal war in the territorial capital. "How?" Samuel asked quietly. Margaret smiled, the expression both loving and triumphant. "I took your letters to Governor Hayes, the ones you wrote to Catherine and Anna over the years. They proved you had no knowledge of any mineral claims in this region, that your presence here was purely coincidental. But more importantly," Hayes continued, "they led us to investigate the claims more thoroughly. What we found was a conspiracy involving fraudulent documents, bribed officials, and systematic theft of territorial resources." Jacob was backing toward his horse, but the territorial officers were already moving to surround him. "This is all circumstantial. You can't prove anything." "Actually, we can," Hayes said. "We have testimony from 3 different territorial clerks who were paid to falsify documents. We have financial records showing payments from shell companies controlled by Mountain Development Corporation. And we have the original geological surveys, which show they were conducted without proper territorial authorization." The confrontation Samuel had expected never materialized. Instead of a climactic battle between brothers, he found himself watching his siblings' empire of revenge collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Justice, it seemed, had its own sense of timing and its own methods of settling family scores. The territorial officers moved with practiced efficiency, but Jacob was not finished fighting. As they approached with restraints, he pulled a revolver from inside his coat, his desperation overriding whatever caution had guided him through years of careful planning. "Stay back!" he shouted, the weapon trembling in his hand. "This isn't over, Samuel. Even if they arrest me, even if they invalidate the claims, you've still lost everything. Your ranch, your fortune, all of it gone because of misplaced loyalty to a daughter who should have stayed dead." Samuel stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Jacob, put the gun down. This doesn't have to end with more violence." "Doesn't it?" Jacob's laugh was wild, unhinged. "You destroyed my life first, Samuel, left me to face creditors and enemies alone while you played the perfect family man. Then when fate finally gave me a chance for justice, you destroyed that too." "I never knew you needed help," Samuel said, continuing his slow approach. "If you had told me about the debts, about the danger, I shouldn't have had to tell you." Jacob's voice cracked with 25 years of accumulated rage. "You were my brother. You should have known, should have cared enough to notice that I was drowning." Sarah moved to flank Jacob from the other side, her mountain-trained stealth allowing her to close distance without drawing attention. The territorial officers held their positions, experienced enough to recognize when a situation required patience rather than force. "Uncle Jacob," Sarah said softly, using the family connection to pierce through his anger. "I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel abandoned and alone. The fire took my mother, left me wandering in the wilderness, half dead. But the people who found me, who raised me, they didn't owe me anything. They helped because that's what family does." Jacob's gun hand wavered as he looked at his niece. "You don't understand. You were a child when it happened. You don't know what it's like to be abandoned by the people who are supposed to stand by you." "I was 6 years old when my world ended," Sarah continued, her voice gentle but firm. 6 years old and alone in the woods, burned and scared, and certain I was going to die. But Marie and Joseph found me, took me in, gave me a new family. They didn't replace what I'd lost. They gave me something different, but just as precious." Margaret stepped forward, her presence adding another layer of calm authority to the volatile situation. "Mr. Clayton, Jacob, I understand feeling abandoned. I felt that way when Samuel kept his past hidden from me, when I learned about you and Catherine and Anna. But holding on to anger only poisons the person carrying it." "You don't know anything about it," Jacob snarled, but the gun was lowering slightly. "I know that Samuel spent 25 years writing letters to his dead family," Margaret said. "Letters full of guilt and regret, wondering if he could have done something different, something better. I know that man, and I know he would have helped you if he'd known you needed it." Samuel was close enough now to see the tears in his brother's eyes, the exhaustion that came from carrying hatred for so long. "Jacob, it's not too late. Put the gun down, and we can talk. Really talk, for the first time in decades." "About what?" Jacob's voice was breaking. "About how you built a new life while I struggled. About how you found happiness while I spent years planning revenge. What's left to talk about?" "About how we're both older now, both tired of carrying old wounds," Samuel said. "About how we might find a way to be brothers again, despite everything that's happened." For a moment, it seemed like Jacob might lower the weapon, might allow the possibility of reconciliation to penetrate his armor of resentment. But then Judge Wells, apparently deciding the situation had gone on too long, spurred his horse forward in an attempt to flee the scene. The sudden movement startled Jacob, causing him to swing the gun toward the fleeing judge. In that instant of distraction, Sarah moved with the quick reflexes of someone trained by mountain life. She tackled her uncle around the waist, sending both of them tumbling to the ground as the revolver discharged harmlessly into the air. The territorial officers were on them immediately, restraining Jacob while Sarah rolled clear. The gun lay in the dirt several feet away, its threat ended, along with Jacob's final attempt at controlling the situation. "It's over," Governor Hayes said with quiet authority. "Jacob Clayton, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and threatening territorial officials with a deadly weapon." As the officers helped Jacob to his feet, he looked at Samuel with eyes that held defeat rather than anger. "I wasted so much time hating you," he said quietly. "So much time I could have spent building something instead of destroying it." "It's not too late to build something now," Samuel replied. Even from prison, even starting over, it's not too late. Jacob was led away without further resistance, his decades of planning and revenge reduced to the simple reality of consequences. Judge Wells had been caught trying to flee and was also taken into custody, his reputation and career destroyed by his association with the conspiracy. As the dust settled and the territorial delegation prepared to leave, Samuel found himself standing with Sarah and Margaret in the center of Hidden Valley, surrounded by the community that had become the unexpected beneficiary of his sacrifice. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked, looking between her father and stepmother. Samuel glanced at the document he had signed, transferring his wealth to the mountain community. "Now we figure out what comes next. Together." Margaret moved to his side, taking his hand in hers. "We'll manage. We always do." Governor Hayes approached with a final piece of business. "Mr. Clayton, given the circumstances and your cooperation in exposing this conspiracy, the territorial government is prepared to offer compensation for your losses. We can't return everything, but we can ensure you're not left destitute." Samuel looked around at the faces of the mountain people, at Sarah's expression of hope and belonging, at Margaret's steady support. "Thank you, Governor, but I don't think that will be necessary. I have everything I need right here." As the sun reached its zenith over Hidden Valley, Samuel Clayton realized that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from discovering what you're truly willing to sacrifice for the people you love. The mountain woman who had shown up at his door had indeed shocked him, but not in the way he had expected. She had shocked him into remembering who he really was, underneath all the wealth and respectability. And that man, it turned out, was exactly who he had always been meant to be. 6 months later, Samuel stood on the porch of his new home in Hidden Valley, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. The cabin was smaller than his ranch house had been, built with his own hands and those of his mountain family, but it felt more like home than anywhere he had lived since before the fire. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the practical clothing she had adopted for mountain life. The transformation had been remarkable. The refined Eastern lady had discovered a strength and resilience that city living had never required. She moved with confidence now among the steep trails and demanding altitude, her natural intelligence finding new applications in the challenges of mountain survival. "Any word from town?" she asked, settling beside him on the bench he had built from local pine. Samuel held up a letter that had arrived with yesterday's supply run. The territorial court finalized Jacob's sentence. 5 years for conspiracy and fraud. Judge Wells got 10 years and permanent disbarment. And the mineral rights officially returned to territorial control. Governor Hayes says they'll likely be leased to legitimate mining companies eventually, but with strict environmental protections and revenue sharing with local communities. Margaret nodded, sipping her coffee as they watched the valley come alive below them. Children were already playing in the central area, their laughter carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The sound never failed to bring Samuel peace evidence that life continued, that hope persisted even after the worst storms. "Do you miss it?" Margaret asked quietly. "The ranch, the life we had down there?" Samuel considered the question carefully, as he had many times over the past months. "I miss the security," he said finally. "The certainty of knowing where our next meal was coming from, the comfort of being respected and prosperous. But I don't miss the isolation of it, the way we were always just the 2 of us against the world. And now we're part of something larger. Sarah has her family back. You have a community that values what you contribute, and I have the chance to be the father I should have been 25 years ago." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah appeared on the trail leading up from the central area. She moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in this environment, but Samuel could see changes in her too. The hard edges of survival had softened somewhat, replaced by the confidence that came from knowing she was no longer alone in the world. "Morning," she called, climbing the steps to join them. "Joseph wants to talk to you about the winter preparations." The new families that joined us after the court ruling are going to need more storage space for food and supplies. The community had grown significantly since word spread about their victory over Mountain Development Corporation. Other mountain people, scattered throughout the territory in small, isolated groups, had made the journey to Hidden Valley, seeking the security and fellowship they had found here. The population had swelled to nearly 70 people, requiring careful planning to ensure everyone could survive the harsh mountain winters. "I'll speak with him after breakfast," Samuel said. "How are the newcomers settling in?" "Better than expected. The Hendricks family from the North Peaks knows more about preserving meat than anyone we've had. And old Tom Brewster turns out to be a skilled blacksmith. He's already improved half our tools." Samuel smiled at the satisfaction in Sarah's voice. She had become one of the community's informal leaders, her unique perspective as someone who bridged the gap between mountain and valley cultures, making her invaluable in integrating new members. Margaret stood, gathering the empty cups. "I promised Marie I'd help with the inventory of medical supplies this morning." The territorial government's compensation included a substantial amount of medicine and equipment. After Margaret went inside, Samuel and Sarah sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter finally able to simply enjoy each other's presence without the weight of crisis pressing down on them. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come to your door that morning?" Sarah asked. Samuel considered it. "I think about it sometimes. You would have found another way to save your people. You're too stubborn to give up." And eventually, Jacob's schemes would have collapsed under their own corruption. "But we wouldn't have found each other again." "No," Samuel agreed, "and that would have been the real tragedy. Not the loss of wealth or status, but the loss of family, the waste of love that could have been shared." Sarah leaned back against the porch railing, studying her father's weathered face. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her pocket. "I've been waiting for the right moment." She withdrew a small wrapped package and handed it to Samuel. Inside, cushioned in soft cloth, was a silver frame containing a new photograph. It showed Samuel, Margaret, Sarah, Joseph, Marie, and a dozen other community members arranged in front of the central meeting hall. But what made Samuel's breath catch was the smaller image tucked into the corner of the frame, the old, water-stained photograph from Catherine's locket, showing him with his first wife and baby Anna. "Both families," Sarah said softly, "past and present, loss and recovery. I thought you should have them together." Samuel felt tears threatening for the second time in his adult life. "Sarah, this is thank you. I've been thinking about names," she continued. "Anna died in that fire, just like Mama. But Sarah Clayton is alive, has a family, has a future. I'd like to keep using Sarah, if that's all right with you. But I want to be Sarah Clayton, not Sarah whatever the mountain folk called me." "Of course," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah Clayton sounds perfect." They were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching on the main trail. A small group of riders emerged from the tree line, and Samuel recognized the lead figure as Governor Hayes. The territorial leader had become a regular visitor to Hidden Valley, checking on the community's progress and using it as an example of successful cooperation between territorial government and local populations. "Governor," Samuel called, rising to greet their visitor. "What brings you back so soon?" Hayes dismounted, with the careful movements of a man more accustomed to office chairs than saddles. "Good news, actually. The territorial legislature has voted to grant Hidden Valley official town status, complete with representation in territorial government and eligibility for federal development funds." Sarah jumped up excitedly. "Really? We're going to be a real town?" "As real as any other in the territory," Hayes confirmed. "Which means you'll need to elect a mayor, establish a town council, and start thinking about long-term civic planning." Samuel and Sarah exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. Joseph was the obvious choice for mayor, his years of leadership having earned him the respect and trust of everyone in the community. "There's more," Hayes continued. "The federal government is interested in establishing Hidden Valley as a model for sustainable mountain development. They're offering grants for education, infrastructure, and resource management programs." As the governor outlined the opportunities available to their community, Samuel felt a deep sense of satisfaction settling over him. The mountain woman who had appeared at his door 6 months ago had indeed brought shock, but it was the kind of shock that shattered old limitations and made new possibilities visible. Hidden Valley would thrive, its people would prosper, and his daughter would never again face the world alone. Margaret had found purpose and community in ways their isolated ranch life had never provided. And Samuel himself had learned that wealth meant more than money, that family extended beyond blood, and that sometimes the greatest victory came from having the courage to lose everything for the sake of love. As the sun climbed higher over the mountains, painting the valley in warmth and light, Samuel Clayton stood surrounded by the people who mattered most and knew that he was exactly where he belonged. The past had finally found him, but instead of bringing destruction, it had brought the chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of old grief. Sometimes, he reflected, the most unexpected visitors bring the most necessary gifts.